Welcome to this e-learning module on participation. My name is Jens Newig. I'm Professor of Governance, Participation and Sustainability at Leuphana University Lüneburg in Germany. You'll find my contact details on the bottom of the slide, and I'll be pleased for any feedback you could give on that presentation. Let us start with a brief overview of today's presentation. First of all, we will talk a little bit about how participation has been institutionalized. Second, what are rationales and benefits of participation? Third, also what are possible drawbacks and where to look out for stumbling blocks. Fourth, what are types and methods of participation? Fifth, I'll try to highlight the importance of the context. Sixth, talk about assessing the outcomes. And seventh, try to give guidelines for conducting participation. So first of all, on the institutionalization of participation. To give you a very brief overview of the importance that public participation has in water management, I put up on the slide a number of key dates of where important rules, important conventions have been agreed on internationally, but also nationally. Let's start with 1990. The United States Negotiated Rulemaking Act was a law not particularly designed for water management, but it's an important stepping stone in the history of institutionalizing public participation in environmental management in general. A few years later, 1992, two important documents that were signed internationally. First of all, the United Nations Rio Declaration. Here the Principle 10 commanded that all decisions concerning the environment, concerning development, be taken in a participatory way, including stakeholders on all important levels of governance. And in the same year, the Dublin Statement on integrated water management was passed, and here again important provisions were taken for participatory water management, and we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. A few years later, again in the United States, the US Environmental Protection Agency proposed a model plan for public participation, not a binding law if you wish, but again, an important stepping stone on showing what can be done in the field of participation in environmental management more in general. Again, a few years later, for the realm of Europe, the United Nations Aarhus Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters was passed not only for the European Union, but also for non-EU member states within Europe at large. Again, a few years later, following the Aarhus Convention and trying to implement also the Aarhus Convention, the European Union Water Framework Directive was passed. So one of the principal legislations in the European Union on water governance, water management, that had at the same time very strong provisions for public participation in several different ways, and we'll look at that in more detail later on. The same year, the Hague Declaration also on water management was passed, and more recently, 2003, the European Union Public Participation Directive, a directive especially designed to implement the Aarhus Convention. Now, to cite from the Hague Declaration, there were 7 challenges named for achieving water security, and the final challenge was governing water wisely to ensure good governance so that the involvement of the public and the interests of all stakeholders are included in the management of water resources. So here a very clear statement of participation at the public, and even more concisely the Dublin Statement on IWRM principles. Hold it. 4 important parts. One of them was that fresh water is a vulnerable resource, that women play a central part, that water has an economic value. But the second principle, for our context, very importantly, showed that water development and management should be based on a participatory approach involving users, planners, and policymakers at all levels. The participatory approach involves raising awareness of the importance of water among public policymakers and the general public. It means that decisions are taken at the lowest appropriate level, with full public consultation and involvement of users in the planning and implementation of water projects. So here again, a very, very clear commitment to participation. And so the Dublin Statement is one of the key stones in the history of participation in water management. Now, why do participation? What are the proposed benefits? What are the rationales why participation ought to be done? I've tried to sketch 3 lines of rationales, 3 lines of discourses that are connected to participation. More in general, but with particular focus also on water management. And historically, perhaps the earliest discourse on participation was that on emancipation. The late 1960s, in many industrialized countries, the United States, but also in Europe, civil society began more to question authorities. The issue of empowerment became very important, and self-determination of local communities was a key issue in raising the discourse on participation. The second discourse is that on legitimacy. So participation as a means to deliver more legitimate decisions in the face of a public that is increasingly remote from elected officials, and thereby trying to enhance transparency of decision making, also to include more democratic values, and also more technical terms like preemptive legal protection play a role here, especially in the planning discussion of the 1970s, 1980s, and also later on. Now, the third discourse, and perhaps nowadays even the most important discourse on participation and why this should be done, is a discourse on effectiveness. So, sort of an instrumental discourse. More and more, both in the academic literature as well as in practice and policy, participation is being promoted because it allows for better informed decisions by involving stakeholders, by involving the public. It's sought to enhance acceptance and identification with decisions, and in the end lead to more effective water governance. So an instrumental rationale, if you wish. And it is this rationale that we will focus later on in particular. But first of all, taking again this early discourse on emancipation. Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation, a short but very influential article published in the Journal of the American Institute of Planners, 1969, so at the end of the 1960s, proposed a typology of participation based on power, based on empowerment, on emancipation. And what Sherry Arnstein proposed was that participation often has a more symbolic value. So the lower steps of this ladder of participation are more manipulation, are therapy, so what she terms non-participation, what maybe organizers would call participation, but she says from a democratic, from an empowerment point of view, this is not really participation. And only the highest steps of this ladder, like partnership, like delegated power, where citizens can actually decide on their own issues, are genuine participation and term citizen power in her terminology. So this article is one of those articles most cited in social science research, and very, very influential for the public participation literature in general and for water management in particular. Now, moving from this more to the effectiveness, to the instrumental rationale. What I show you here is a matrix on different kinds and dimensions of modern sustainability problems, of which many water problems are part. You'll find on the vertical axis three basic problem dimensions. One is the ambivalence of goals, second is uncertainty of dynamics, third is distribution of power. What this means is often sustainability problems are highly ambivalent. We don't really know what we actually mean, what we actually want. Second, sustainability problems can be highly uncertain. We don't really know what is happening. Climate change and its impacts on water, for instance, are not really determined. We don't know which parts of the world will be drier, will become wetter, will become more vulnerable. So these kinds of dynamics place an important challenge for decision making in water governance. And thirdly, even if we knew what the dynamics are and if we were clear about our goals, it is often the case that the actors that actually have the power to shape development are very spread, are very distributed. It's very difficult to implement really decisions because of this fragmentation. And I'll think of these decisions and try to relate these to different methods of governance, to different methods of how to cope with these. You can have on the left-hand side, we'll see sort of classical command and control approaches that only hold when there is neither ambivalence nor uncertainty nor a high distribution of power. But the more we move to the right and the higher sort of the ambivalence, uncertainty and distribution of the problem at hand is, the more we're dealing with learning approaches, with network approaches, with reflexive approaches, of which participation plays a central role, especially in the learning and negotiation approaches to govern complex sustainability problems. Now, to put this in more clear words, I've shown you two quotes here, one from a European Union research project, and Hubert Heinold here in the year 2002 holds that participation leads to a higher degree of sustainable and innovative outcomes. And second, from a policy document, the European Commission expects that public participation is not an end in itself, but a tool to achieve the environmental objectives of a water-related directive here. So very clearly put here the instrumental rationale of public participation rather than an emancipatory or a legitimacy-oriented rationale. So then more concretely, what are the assumed relations between participation and effective water governance? So on the one hand, it is claimed that participation produces outputs with high environmental standards. But with outputs, I mean plans, agreements, contracts, policies, everything that's written down, or maybe not written down, but that is collectively agreed on. And participation is now thought to open up decision-making networks. So this sort of assumes that historically or classically, decision-making, especially in water governance, is often very technically related. We have sometimes closed circles of experts and policymakers, and participation now allows to widen this decision-making context and especially include groups that have traditionally not been included in these processes. For instance, environmental NGOs, for instance, women's organizations, what have you. So an opening up and thereby broadening also the information base. So different kinds of local, sometimes lay knowledge also comes in to the decision making and thereby enhances the quality of his thought to enhance the quality of decision making. Secondly, more relating to the process of decision making, deliberation, negotiation is thought to deliver more innovative concepts, to more innovative solutions of participation by sitting at the table, by negotiating pros and cons of the decisions that are at stake. Now, on the other hand, participation is also thought to improve outcomes. So not only what is written on paper, but what is in the end implemented in terms of clearly visible results, improving water quality, for instance, by participation. So by including effective interests, the procedural justice argument comes into play here. What does procedural justice mean? Procedural justice means that people who are included in a decision-making process, who view the decision-making process as a fair process, are more likely to accept what comes out of this process, even if their own personal interests are not reflected in the output. So procedural justice plays an important role, or can play an important role, in improving acceptance and perhaps identification of outputs by those who actually will implement the decisions later on. Also, policy addressees, if they are included in the process, are earlier informed on what is going to happen, and also perhaps partnerships may form during the implementation process, and all these arguments can eventually lead to the fact that participation improves implementation of decisions and not only the outputs. So this, you could call this the sort of instrumental claim with participation. Again, on the one hand, better decisions through participation, on the other hand, enhanced implementation. So more informed decisions, more ecological decisions, more creative decisions. On the other hand, better information, better acceptance, improved compliance, less litigation, will in the end lead to improved water management and a more complete and swift implementation of measures. Also, participation is likely to resolve conflicts on water. So just to give you a few examples, water is a subject that is very likely to produce conflicts. For instance, agriculture in dry regions can lead to groundwater depletion. In a region in Germany that I've researched more intensively, intensive agriculture, livestock farming can lead to nutrient intakes into groundwater. Recreational uses can conflict with conservation uses, conservation goals. Hydropower in natural waters can pose problems for ecology and what have you. And all these conflicts are thought to be better resolved by including all these stakeholders in the decision-making process in a participatory process. Now, what are drawbacks? What are stumbling blocks? Where to look out for in public participation in water management? So let me first of all give you some arguments from the theoretical literature. You'll find in the literature on rational choice and collective action theory that interests and power positions often play a role such that participation is very difficult to conduct. Also from implementation theory, you will find that often a high number of actors included in a decision-making process, such as in participation, are often prohibitively high, and these clearance points and veto plays lead to the fact that it's not possible to implement anything at all. And thirdly, authors researching group behavior from social psychology found various mechanisms that can pose problems for participation. For instance, Bill Cook found that in group processes that are so typical for participation, often enough the group shifts towards taking more risky decisions, that they can develop a certain group think that is close to arguments from outside. And that can also lead to manipulation by some people in the group who are more influential than others. So especially sort of contradicting the positive assumptions on participation. So these are things to look out for when designing participation. And to sum this up, there are certain pros and there are also cons of participation. On the pro side, the emancipatory potential, the increased legitimacy, social learning, better informed decisions, higher acceptance and implementation. On the con side, also the possibility to have an illegitimate influence of powerful interests, especially in those participation exercises where people can freely choose whether to participate or not. It is often enough those powerful stakeholders that do participate that leads to an influence that is not the one that was originally devised when thinking of participation. Also, it is can be that, especially in very consensual processes, decisions can be taken at the lowest common denominator. Some people fear also that expertise is replaced by opinion. Public participation can be costly, at least at the first instance, and can also lead to what Robert Dahl has termed a democratic dilemma between citizen participation and system effectiveness. What he means is that typically participatory decisions are good when they are taken at a very local level of decision making. Then it is possible to include all the relevant stakeholders and decisions can be taken very close to those who are concerned by these decisions. On the other hand, he holds that often enough environmental, water-related problems can only be taken can only effectively be taken at a high level of governance, integrating all relevant problem dimensions. But this contrasts then the demand that participation needs to be done on a more local level. So a certain theoretical dilemma that Dahl has constructed here. So in the end, there are pros and cons. Participation is in a way theoretically contested. There is also conflicting empirical evidence. So it is not always very clear whether or not it is good to conduct public participation. One particular challenge to participatory approaches is what Garrett Hardin, in his famous 1968 science article, calls the tragedy of the commons. And he gives the example of a medieval commons where people can have their cattle graze, and because of the self-interest of each of these shepherds, they will tend to let their cattle graze on that commons to an extent that it is overexploited after a certain time, because the interests and the rationality of every single act leads them to do so, and therein lies the tragedy. Garrett Hardin calls it, towards which all men rush in such a situation. Now, this metaphor of a commons that is depleted by those who use that collectively can be extended, of course, and has been extended by many to different kinds of resources, such as water resources and many other depletable and slowly renewable resources. In game theoretic terms, this can be called a prisoner's dilemma. And the result, or the consequence of such a social dilemma situation is that either the state will have to regulate the resource and limit access to it, or, according to Hardin, privatization. So dividing the land into separate plots where each shepherd privately manages the land, or where strips of water can be managed privately by those who own that land. Now, there is no room for participation, for cooperation in that approach. Now, several years later, in 1990, Elinor Ostrom published a famous book on governing the commons as an explicit answer to Hardin's pessimistic view on this tragedy of the commons. Elinor Ostrom has received the Nobel Prize for Economics last year. And what she holds is that neither the state nor privatization are necessarily the best solutions to using a scarce resource, collectively use a scarce resource. But what she holds is that it's in particular the involvement of all affected parties in the joint development of institutions, which are collective rules and norms, in the use of natural resources that is most effective for actually managing these scarce resources. So a totally different aspect. And Elinor Ostrom has empirically studied a wealth of cooperative participatory regimes, many of which in the realm of water governance. Fisheries are one prominent example that she has studied. Just to give you a short example here, fisheries in Alanya in Turkey. Here a local fishery cooperative of approximately 100 fishers has developed their own rules for managing their fishing sites. And the agreement here is that fishers are allocated by chance to certain fishing locations from May to September, which is the fishing time. And the idea is here to have a rotating system because of fish migration. And that leads to equal chances for each fisher to fish at the best sites. It leads to no overfishing, and also no resources for conflict resolution are needed, because the whole institution is self-monitoring, self-enforcing through the fishers of themselves. And Ostrom also found that there are hardly any violations of the rules. So in a admittedly very local setting here, people have managed to self-regulate, to self-steer their use of a natural resource, almost in the way Sherry Arnstein would have thought of this as citizen control, if you wish. Now, looking more in particular at the level on which decisions are being taken, on which participation takes place. The Alanya example that Ostrom showed us is a very local example of a very local cooperative. Let me present you some findings from Thomas Kuhns, who holds that citizens living in close spatial proximity to a natural resource typically tend to favor its economic exploitation, as opposed to those living farther away tend to favor its conservation. So this again may pose a challenge to participation if participation is something that is very local, but people locally tend not to favor the conservation of the resource. Next to this, Kuhns holds, based on empirical research, that where decision competencies regarding environmental issues are at lower, more local levels of governance, a stronger and more influential participation of citizens and stakeholders with economic interests can be expected. So one follows from the other, and both poses a serious challenge to local participation because of this observed interests regarding specific resources. So what are different methods of participation in water management? First of all, I think we're now in a position to try a definition of what is public participation. Let me try a working definition that is admittedly complex, but I believe captures the most important elements of participation. So public participation comprises all forms of public decision-making in which non-state actors, individual or collective, and who are not routinely engaged in this decision making and who broadly represent those who are affected by the decision or the problem it seeks to address, have a substantial influence on a collectively binding decision through a minimum of open input. This definition relates to work done by Ortwin Renn and Thomas Webler, but also on Rowe and Fruer, who proposed similar definitions of public participation. What you can see from this attempt to define is that participation has both a process component, so how are decisions being taken, and an actor-related component, who participates in these decisions. And you can also see that there is a difference in participation and other similar concepts, such as democratic elections or engagement. In particular, what is not included in this definition of public participation are routine processes in which citizens are involved, such as public referenda, for instance, where you can only tick like a box, yes or no, for instance. So that would be more closely to elections or referenda. On the other hand, engagement would be something that is not public participation because it does not relate to decisions. For instance, when citizens plan an initiative and plant trees, for instance, or engage otherwise for the environment, without this being part of a decision-making process that binds themselves or that binds someone else, in the sense that they are empowered by doing so, it would also not count as participation in this attempt to define it. What you may also see from this definition is that participation is not a yes or no thing, but processes can be more or less participatory, and scholars have always acknowledged that there is this more or less in participation. Let's recall the Ladder of Citizen Participation by Sherry Arnstein, who explicitly held that manipulation, therapy, and forming would be forms of participation that are less intensive than those at the top, like partnership, delegate power, citizens control. So really a no participation, little participation, very much participation. Now this typology is based on power, and other scholars have developed typologies or ladders of participation based on information flows, such as Rowe and Fruer, for instance. And what I propose here is based also on work of Ark and Fang, is that there are three dimensions to participation that actually play a role. First of all, it's who participates, so the scope of participants. Is it citizens? Is it NGOs? Is it industry? What is the geographical scale on which the participatory exercise is taking place? So when asking for citizens' control in Arnstein's sense, the question is always who exerts this influence. So who controls what is at stake. It's not perhaps so easy as Arnstein put it in her letter, that is basically a one-dimensional model. Now, second, again relating to work of Rowe and Fruer, the direction and intensity of information flow. Information that is given by the project organizer, by the state, by the government, to the non-state actors, to the participants. On the other hand, consultation, so gaining information from the participants. And thirdly, face-to-face interaction, deliberation, group processes in which direct information in exchange, interchange can take place. And the third dimension, really regarding to Arnstein's work and that of others, relating directly to the influence participants are given, the influence they can actually exert on the decision at stake. So participation, more or less, yes, but in at least three different dimensions, and so that opens up a whole variety of participatory methods and settings that can be chosen from when tackling a particular water governance problem. So what are methods? Methods of participation are manifold, and you will find a myriad of different instruments, different types of participation. You find a huge literature on how to conduct participatory processes. So I would just pick a number of some very established methods, but again, there are hundreds and thousands of methods available to do participation. One of the most simplest methods is to conduct hearings. You invite either a limited set or an open set of the public citizens to join a hearing. This can be held in a large hall or wherever. You can inform the public, you can gain some information by doing some consultation, but basically it's sort of a one-to-many kind of participatory exercise. In the same vein, but using different medium, is consultation on the internet, something that has become quite popular and is being done quite often at the moment, is internet consultation. So has the possibility to put very detailed information, very detailed material on proposed plans, on all the water-related issues that are at stake on the internet. So everyone has the possibility to read this, to work through all the material, and is able to then send comments to the proposed measures to the administration. So a very open method, but of course, again, one-to-many and no deliberation, no direct exchange that is possible. A very different method is that of citizens' juries, and closely to that of planning cells that have been developed both in Europe and in North America. And the idea here is to selectively invite a certain fraction of, or a small group of citizens to, in a particular area, to develop or to aid in the development of a particular plan. And here typically one would see that these citizens are broadly representative, like one could see that there is a certain balance in age, in gender, in expertise, and so forth. Citizens are typically remunerated for their engagement in these groups, and they last for maybe several days. They can hear experts, and they should in the end come to a conclusion, so really serve as a sort of jury and conclude with a recommendation on what to do later on. So citizens' juries can have the advantage of being a more neutral means of decision making than typical political processes. They have the advantage of bringing in additional expertise that citizens can hear, and also there are many positive experiences with citizens' juries where really deliberation and innovative finding of new ideas plays an important role. So in an ideal setting, citizens would really come to a conclusion that maybe would not have been taken otherwise. So a popular instrument, but that also is costly and takes a lot of time, but where substantial experience has been gained with as well. And much more complex, of course, than these consultative forms such as hearings or internet consultation. Now, other forms are even more deliberative, like public deliberative forums, a bit more open than citizens' juries. popular in the United States are citizens advisory committees, which are more institutionalized, not so short-term than citizens juries, but where citizens can sort of see that decision-making processes are conducted in an orderly manner and bring in additional expertise on a more long-term basis. Stakeholder dialogues typically include interest group representatives rather than citizens. Consensus workshops are used typically when specific conflicts are to be solved. In the field of water management, particularly important are watershed partnerships that you also find very much in the United States, sometimes bottom-up formed, sometimes more top-down formed, but these are more long-term collaborative and participatory forms of decision-making where a diverse number of issues regarding the watershed in which people live and work are addressed. So just to give you an idea of what kind of methods may be drawn on, and there are several more, of course. To give you one particular concrete example of how participation can aid in policy setting. It's here the Albemarle-Pamlico estuarine case published by Kuntz and co-authors in 2004. The setting was North Carolina in the mid-1980s. And here a huge, second largest estuarine system, second largest in the US, was ecologically endangered by continuing growth, development in that area. And in this setting, concerned citizens and scientists initiated a process, like really from the bottom up, that aimed to include the particular area in the National Environmental Program, which would have and had particular benefits for that area. They formed a citizen advisory committee, a strong representation also of environmental groups, and after considerable time, this produced an output, which was a plan with far-reaching measures to protect the endangered estuary. And also this participatory process, long-term process, led to a rather complete implementation of the measures that were later on agreed on. So what this basically is a bottom-up, temporary, if not long-term, but still temporary, bottom-up type of participation that aided in setting, agreeing on specific local, regional policies. Now, the importance of context. So far we have talked of methods of what participation actually is, and I would now like to highlight the importance the particular context makes for choosing participatory methods. And I will do so by taking the European Water Framework Directive we talked about earlier as an example. Framework Directive and its implementation in a particular setting. Now, first of all, to give you an example, or to give you a more clear picture of what the Water Framework Directive is, you can see here is a policy cycle that is common to political science and other related disciplines, starting with an agenda setting phase in the 1990s, where people in Europe felt that water legislation was too fragmented and one needed a more stringent legislation that was passed then in the year 2000. The Water Framework Directive needs implementation. There needs to be clear measures on the local level that have to be agreed on and implemented later on. Now, this implementation again includes a sort of secondary policy cycle in that it commands the formulation of programs of measures and river basin management plans that have to be updated every 6 years. So the implementation of the Water Framework Directive itself has a policy cycle within it, and this continuous update every 6 years allows for a learning procedure, because the results of these river basin management planning can be incorporated in the next planning cycle. Now, the Water Framework Directive, as one of the few examples of legislation, not only includes very strict environmental goals and water management related goals, but also, as mentioned earlier, includes a number of requirements regarding public participation. This public participation in particular relates to the formulation of these river basin management plans and programs of measure I talked about a minute ago. Public participation, according to the Water Framework Directive, shall take place on 3 levels. One is information supply, so sort of the basis of all participation according to the directive. All citizens, all people that have to do, all stakeholders with water-related issues, shall have access to the important information by the administration, so information supply. And second, there shall be consultation on the draft management plans, on the formulation of these programs of measures. This is typically done by internet, but also on different means. And thirdly, and most intensively, the directive proposes active involvement as something that is not perhaps mandatory in a strict legal sense, but that shall be encouraged by the European member states. So a more active involvement in the formulation of these programs of measures and management plans, but also all other aspects regarding the implementation of the directive. So different forms of participation that can be characterized differently regarding the typology we worked on earlier. Now, to give you a view on where this participation can actually take place, you see on this slide different hierarchical levels of decision making. On the very top, the European Union has proposed a number of so-called guidance documents that have been devised in an institution called Common Implementation Strategy, or short CIS, a process that has almost been completed, but that was done in a somewhat participatory way, in that groups from different countries were invited to work on schemes, on guidance documents that were later published in the year 2003 that would aid a coherent implementation of the Water Framework Directive. So participation in the implementation of the directive at the very top level of the European Union. Then going down on the level of the member states, taking here the example of Germany, the federal government will pass some legislation in order to implement the directive. However, there is little or no participation on that level. But on the level of the River Basin Management Plan, which is to be on the level of the river basin, on an international or national river basin district, you can see these on the left-hand side. So trying to match natural and administrative scales of decision-making. And here again, participation in terms of a consultation has to take place. Now, going yet more down, you will find different regional levels, for instance, on different federal states, or even lower, different counties, more on the sub-basin level. And some federal states in Germany, for instance, have installed public participation exercises that more relate to the active participation on the level of these subbasins, not necessarily on the level of water bodies. This is a very local level where hardly any participation actually takes place. But it gives you a view on the difficulty in choosing the right level on which participation will take place. Now, to take a closer look at one member state in which the Water Framework Directive is being implemented, which will be Germany here. I cite a quote from Tanja Börze, who is a bit critical about the possibility to actually implement new governance innovations such as participation. And she says that member states such as Germany, Spain, which rely heavily on interventionist command and control regulatory instruments imposing material standards, face significant problems in incorporating new procedural and communicative instruments into their legal and administrative structures. And this misfit between European and domestic policy instruments is likely to provoke the resistance of public administration in implementation. Rather than facilitating implementation, these new governance forms become an implementation problem themselves. So a rather pessimistic view on whether or not participation will actually have the desired, be implemented and have the desired effects. So as a general comment, participation has been implemented in Germany, but very, very differently across the different federal states. There is a common platform for internet consultation, and there is a national body that coordinates participation in Germany, which is the Federal State Working Group on Water Issues, the so-called LAWA. What you can see here are the different river basin districts in Germany that have been constructed according to the Water Framework Directive and that serve as the principal geographical regions where to implement the directive and thereby also where to implement participation. So what kind of forms do we find in Germany in order to implement active participation according to the Water Framework Directive? What you can see here is different forms according to the question of whether the broad public or selected representatives are included, so the form of participation, and whether this takes place at a local or more at the state level. And basically what you can see is that there's sort of a correlation between these two aspects in the respect that the more participation takes place at the state level, it's rather the broad public that is included, and the more you go down to the local level, it's more selected representatives and also more intensive forms of participation. With the exception of the steering group in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is both a small group, selected representatives, but on a state level. What we will look more closely at now is the federal state of Lower Saxony, which you can find in the top left part of Germany. Lower Saxony has implemented around 30 very local participatory decision-making bodies that are situated on the local level of watersheds. So what is interesting about this is that on the one hand, it's a watershed approach regarding natural geographical scales. On the other hand, this is being done only in the federal state of Lower Saxony. So again, on a territorial border, as opposed to what the Water Framework Directive originally designed, namely having participation and the whole implementation taking place on the level of river basins. So in Lower Saxony, different forms have taken place, starting from information as a common web page that has been implemented, different conferences on first inventory, different roadshows have been implemented, a common council for the whole state has been put into place as a consultative form, and as the highest level of active involvement, both an expert group has been installed, and these around 30 area corporations I talked about earlier on the level of watersheds. And now looking more closely at these area corporations, they were initiated by a ministerial decree, so very formally installed. The goal is to devise innovative solutions to implement the Water Framework Directive, drawing on regional knowledge and creative discussions. And these groups were supposed to have about 10 representatives from water management, from agriculture, from industry, from environmental groups, but also from communities, from municipalities, counties, and so forth. There was in fact a lot of delegation of power to these non-state actors, because they really had the task to participate in the formulation of the regional programs of measures. And this is a form of participation that you could call an institutionalized, long-term, or actually top-down initiated form of participation. And looking more closely at one of these area corporations, you can see here the Hase River in the southwest of Lower Saxony. And what you can see on the larger picture here is that this hydrological area, so the catchment of the Hase River, crosses the boundaries of a number of counties that are in this region. And this poses a problem for participation. The original idea of the government of Lower Saxony was that in each area cooperation, only one representative of the counties, one of the cities, one of agricultural interests, and so forth would have a place. But now you can see that as the catchment touches so many different counties, each of these counties wants to send a representative to the area corporation. The more so as you have upstream and downstream problems, different regional characteristics, different uses of water, of groundwater. So in the end, you find 6 representatives instead of 1 of the counties alone in this area cooperation. And the result is, because other groups as well, like agriculture, water management, they're also organized on a county level. So the result is that the area corporation ends up with not 10 members, but maybe with 20 or 30 members in their group, making it much more difficult to actually discuss, deliberate solutions and find innovative ways how to implement the directive and how to which measures are to take. So the approach that in theory makes much sense to implement a water directive on a watershed or catchment level implies difficulties from a participatory, from a governance point of view, when seeing that there is this mismatch between territorial units of governance and these new hydrological units of governance. Now that we've talked a lot about different processes, different types of participation, let's now have a closer look at assessing the outcomes. What comes out of participatory processes in terms of delivering more environmental, more water-related, more sustainability-related outcomes. To give you one concrete example, again in Germany, here in the eastern part, in the early 1990s, the so-called Spreewald Riparian Land Project was initiated. This was a multi-year mediated participatory process involving a multitude of local citizens and stakeholders. The setting was that in a more top-down manner, a federal agency proposed very intensive measures to protect the area of the Spreewald, but local interests, fishery, tourism, agriculture, and so forth, very much compromised these initial ambitious conservation goals of the federal agency, because they saw themselves and their daily business put in danger by these very strict conservation goals. So this intensive involvement of locals led on the one hand to less ambitious goals, but on the other hand, it led to a widely accepted and implementable conservation plan, much as opposed to the original plan that was not being accepted at all by these local stakeholders. So what we find is a difference in what the output due to the participatory process was, and the outcome in terms of the actual implementation of these measures that were agreed on. Output was compromised, less ambitious goals on water management. Outcome, due to the higher acceptance, possibly sort of better or more ecological outcome in terms of the standard that was actually implemented. Now, to look at that in a more abstract, more conceptual way, we can conceive of a causal chain regarding process and outcomes that starts the basic assumption that the participatory process that you can see here on the left-hand side of the slide eventually leads to improvements in environmental quality, but involving different intermediary variables, such as social outcomes like learning that can take place, trust building between the participants, acceptance of the plan, and the substantive output, of course. So what is the standard of decisions that takes place? And to differentiate between output and outcomes really makes sense, as you saw in the Spreewald example, that the output can be compromised, for instance, by a participatory process, but not the outcome. So both play a different role in implementing public participation. Also, what you can see in this diagram is that the context, the whole setting, supposedly at least makes an important difference for the fact whether or not participation leads to improved outputs and outcomes. To give you some empirical insights from a meta-analysis of local water governance case studies. A colleague and I looked at 19 cases of participatory water governance, mostly across North America, but some also in Europe. You could see that there's a very wide range of issues. Some of these started early in the 1970s, some around the year 2000, the Spreewald case being one of these. What does this meta-analysis tell us? Meta-analysis looking across these cases revealed that outputs were improved in a small number of cases, whereas in a larger number, 9 cases of these, we found a deterioration of outputs, as opposed to a hypothetical top-down decision-making alternative. On the other hand, the outcome, so what actually was implemented, seemed to have been improved by participation, because only in 3 cases we found a deterioration, in 7 we found an improvement. Very importantly, we also found a highly strong correlation between actor interests and water governance outcomes. So what does that mean? It means that it depends very much on who is included in the participatory process, on what comes out in terms of an agreed plan or even an outcome that is later on implemented. So for instance, if you have a set of stakeholders, as in the Spreewald case, who are very much opposed to a very strict water governance measures, improving water quality, then it is very likely also that the output, that is the plan that is being produced, reflects these interests and may compromise these ambitious ecological goals. Whereas on the other hand, if you include environmental interests such as environmental NGOs and so forth, it is more likely that the plan also reflects these interests and perhaps leads to a decision with a higher ecological standard as regards water quality, for instance. Also, we found a high relevance of context variables such as the ecological scale on which the geographical scale on which the process has taken place, whether it was initiated in a top-down manner or in a bottom-up manner, and many other context variables that played a role. Now, to conclude this unit on participation in IWRM, let me try to formulate a number of guidelines for conducting participation, summing up sort of the lessons learned from the material that we worked through before. Now, some important issues to consider. First of all, we saw that participation can have very different goals, very different rationales. And depending on what is the aim of participation, what is the aim of the decision-making process, it will lead to different forms of participation, will lead to different actors, different stakeholders to be included. So first of all, it's very important to reflect on the goals. Is participation desirable at all? Why should it be desirable? Is it to seek expertise? Is it to gain legitimacy? Is it to further implementation? And also perhaps consider what are possible trade-offs. What are maybe even alternatives to participation? Not all decision-making processes, not all water governance processes are suitable for participation in an equal manner. But if you decide to do participation, then it's a question of when to conduct participation. In many handbooks, many guidelines, you will find that it's best to conduct participation very early on in order to involve stakeholders when they can even plan the whole process, when the whole process is not at the stage that the most important decisions have already been made and stakeholders feel they are sort of being used only to accept decisions that have been taken earlier on. So typically it would be a good idea to conduct participation at an early stage, but there are also arguments to do this at a later stage, for instance, when specific expertise is needed by specific groups, because particular issues come up at later stages in a decision-making process. So I think very important to be considered. Also, of course, who to include. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the citizens? Who is the group of people, of actors to be included? A good tool, very helpful, is to conduct a stakeholder analysis before embarking on a participatory process. Are you interested in including experts, interest groups, citizens. There's a variety of tools available in mapping stakeholders, seeing what the networks are, who is important and who's maybe not so important to be included in a participatory process. Also, very importantly, plan for the necessary resources. Participation typically involves resources such as staff time, expenses of participants. Maybe you wish to involve an external facilitator who is more neutral in the process. So all these can cost and have to be taken into account. Also, most importantly perhaps, is that a careful choice of participation methods takes place. We've talked briefly about some of these, and they all have the specific pros and cons. So rather take more time to choose an appropriate participation method. Also, very importantly, the scope of the process and the roles and responsibilities should be clarified right from the beginning. This can be termed also expectation management. A lesson from many participatory exercises, many participatory processes has been that citizens, stakeholders, non-state actors have different expectations from what the agency has. And often enough, this results in frustration because, for instance, citizens think they can influence certain decisions while this is perhaps even legally not possible. So the scope of the process, what can be decided and what cannot be decided in a participatory process should really be clarified as early as possible. Finally, when the process is over, that is, when there is a particular process, of course, there's the chance to learn from this process. And this chance is when monitoring and evaluating both the participatory approach as well as the results that have been gained. It is possible to reflect on what has been done, what was good, what was bad, perhaps how things would be conducted differently. And this reflection, these results, especially when done in a more systematic manner, can really be a huge asset for future participatory exercises, which these reflections can be made useful. Now, who to include? Typical key stakeholders on the side of the government, on the side of the state, are government ministries, related institutions involved in national development planning and policy making. Also key water-related sectors, including domestic water supply and sanitation, irrigation, agriculture, energy, health, industry, transport, fisheries, tourism, what have you. Also water utilities, of course, agencies, related bodies such as water boards or water user associations. So a lot of stakeholders that can potentially be included. Typical non-state actors that are important to be considered in a participatory process are local communities, community-based organizations, for instance, mayors. It can also be religious leaders. The private sector, of course, including but not limited to water supply and sanitation service providers. Financial agencies, for instance, donor agencies, international banks, depending on the setting, also microcredit institutions, can be sectoral interest groups, such as farmers and fishermen, depending on the context, also women's groups and associations, representatives of indigenous communities, other non-governmental organizations, such as environmental organizations, certain cases also media representatives, and last but perhaps not least, research and training institutions, including universities. So a range of stakeholders that can typically be included. Of course, this list is not comprehensive, and of course, some of these may not play a role in a particular context. So So what are success factors for an effective participatory water management? On the one hand, it's important that the participants that are to be invited have the capacity to participate in a meaningful way. They have to have a certain awareness of the problem, that it's relevant for them to participate. They have this, at least a certain level of knowledge that they can bring in, they can share with other participants, and of course a willingness to engage in the participatory process. On the other hand, the choice of participation method should be clearly tailored to the specific context it's in, to the level of governance, from the local to the global, depending on the phase of the policy cycle you're in, from the agenda setting to the policy formulation or implementation phase. And of course the spatial fit of the natural governance scale to the territorial governance scale, as we've seen in the example of the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. And what are particular challenges? Participation in river basin governance can be an arena for collective learning, but of course, as we have seen on the example of Lower Saxony, there can also be parallel structures to the established territorial decision-making bodies. Watershed here, territorial counties there. This could inhibit the learning process that one is after in participation. Also a particular challenge is to integrate learning efforts across the different administrative levels. What is learned on one level doesn't necessarily mean that this learning also takes place on the higher administrative levels. Real systematic learning could be done through policy experimentation. We try to do something here, try to do something else at another place, but this is seldom being done. In some countries, such as China, there are systematic efforts at doing policy learning in water governance. So perhaps the most important conclusion from all this is that one size doesn't fit all. I believe it's not possible to find the approach to water governance, water management, taking this or that participatory mechanism. But rather, I would follow Helen Ingram, who proposes a contextual approach to the design of water resources governance, taking into account the specific settings in which we are and choose the mechanisms, participatory or not, that are specifically tailored to this particular situation. Now, what have we learned about participation in integrated water resources management? Surely participation is no panacea, seeing advantages, disadvantages, but if tailored to the specific context, can surely be most helpful for water resources management. Now, to conclude, I've assembled a number of key readings for understanding participation in integrated water resources management. First text by Sherry Arnstein. We've already talked about the famous letter of citizens' participation. Then two texts by Jerome Deli-Priscoli and Eric Mostertz about public participation, why it is important, what are the reasons, what are stumbling blocks in water management. Text by Elinor Ostrom, the famous book on governing the commons. And finally, a shorter text by the Global Water Partnership, a handbook on developing integrated water resources management strategies with a high focus also on participatory methods. And this gives you a perspective on participation within the broader context of integrated water resources management. Finally, for those of you who are interested in particular aspects or theories, concepts or empirical results presented here, I've assembled a bit longer list of further readings. So I thank you for listening, and would be glad to receive any feedback on this presentation, and you will see the contact details on the bottom of the slide. I thank you.